Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale filled with mystery and hidden truths, written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Don't forget to subscribe and prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of intrigue. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Puzzle of the Stolen Shadow. The evening fog hung thick across the streets of London, wrapping the city in a ghostly veil. The gas lamps cast long, flickering shadows that merged with the mist, creating an almost ethereal scene that seemed to carry an air of mystery in its very stillness. Sherlock Holmes, his silhouette sharp against the dim light, moved with a deliberate, almost predatory grace through the fog. His coat billowed slightly as he walked, the echo of his footsteps lost in the vast emptiness of the streets. It was a city that, for all its bustle, often held its breath in the quiet corners where the unknown lingered. Holmes's mind, as sharp and precise as the blade of a well-honed knife, was consumed with the thoughts of his latest challenge. His cane clicked rhythmically on the cobblestones as he proceeded towards his destination, a small, almost inconspicuous building tucked in the shadows of the grander structures of London. The very location seemed to echo the nature of the case he was about to delve into: obscure, enigmatic, and subtly dangerous. At his side, Dr. John Watson kept a steady pace, though his presence was less a match for Holmes's unrelenting focus. Watson had long since come to accept that when Holmes's mind was engaged, there was little room for conversation, and so the two walked in silence. The doctor's gaze often flickered to Holmes, studying the subtle changes in his friend's demeanour, the slight tightening of his jaw, the occasional furrow of his brow, the way his eyes darted from one shadow to the next, as if searching for the unseen. Holmes did not seem to notice Watson's gaze, his attention fully occupied by the task ahead. It had been a peculiar letter that had set this particular case in motion. A letter from an old acquaintance, Lord Kilburn, asking for Holmes's expertise in a matter that was, according to the brief details enclosed, beyond ordinary comprehension. The matter was delicate, Lord Kilburn had written, and the consequences of failure would be grave. The pair arrived at Kilburn's residence, a grand yet unremarkable townhouse tucked between other similar buildings in the West End. The house itself seemed like an afterthought, the grandeur of its surroundings masking the quiet mystery it contained. Holmes paused at the entrance, his keen eyes scanning the building with a subtle intensity, noting every minor detail from the arrangement of the curtains to the faint sounds drifting from the open windows above. "Watson, you are to observe carefully and remain silent unless asked. This case will require all of my faculties, and I expect nothing less from you," Holmes said, his voice low but firm. His words were not so much a command as a reflection of his own anticipation, his mind already working, already piecing together the puzzle that had yet to be fully revealed. Watson nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. Holmes's manner was often distant, even aloof, but there was something more in his tone now, an urgency that hinted at a complexity to the case beyond their initial understanding. He had seen Holmes unravel mysteries before, but this one, for reasons he could not yet discern, seemed different. The door creaked open, and a tall figure appeared in the threshold. Lord Kilburn, his face ashen and taut with concern, stepped forward to greet them. His gaze flickered over Holmes, then moved quickly to Watson, as though assessing the newcomer. The Lord's eyes, clouded with something akin to fear, shifted back to Holmes, who, with his usual quiet confidence, met the gaze without hesitation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so promptly. I fear we are in dire straits," Lord Kilburn said, his voice shaky, yet controlled. Holmes did not immediately respond, but his eyes, those piercing, calculating eyes, sized up Lord Kilburn in the briefest of moments. There was something off about him, something that went beyond the evident anxiety. Lord Kilburn was a man who had long been accustomed to influence, to control, but now that facade seemed to crumble at the edges. Holmes took a slow step forward, his gaze unwavering. "Lead the way, Lord Kilburn," Holmes said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken authority. There was no need for pleasantries now. The business at hand was far more pressing. The Lord stepped back, gesturing for them to enter. Inside, the house was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the years of secrets held within them. As they moved deeper into the house, the silence between the three men grew heavier, almost palpable. Holmes took it all in, the atmosphere, the faintest creaks of the floorboards, the muted voices of servants somewhere beyond the rooms. It was not yet clear to him what the case would entail, but one thing was certain. The puzzle had already begun to take shape, and its pieces were moving swiftly into place. The door to the study creaked open, and Holmes stepped inside without hesitation. Lord Kilburn followed, but Watson lingered at the threshold, his gaze drifting between the two men. As the door shut behind them, Watson took a moment to consider the path ahead. They had entered a house filled with hidden truths, and Holmes, his mind already far ahead, was about to begin the process of unravelling them. The study was a stark contrast to the looming shadow of uncertainty that hung in the hallway. Polished mahogany furniture gleamed softly under the flickering gaslight. The walls were adorned with tapestries that whispered of long-forgotten history, and the scent of leather-bound books filled the air. It was a place for reflection, but now it seemed to echo with an unspoken tension, the very air thick with anticipation. Holmes stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning every inch with methodical precision. His fingers lightly brushed against the back of an armchair as he moved, cataloguing the room in his mind. Watson, following closely behind, took a seat by the window, his gaze flitting nervously between the Lord and his daughter, who now stood silently by her father. Lord Kilburn's features were drawn, his eyes darting around as though seeking something that wasn't there. His hands trembled as he held out a glass of brandy to Holmes, who accepted it with a single nod, his fingers wrapping around the delicate crystal. "Do sit, Mr. Holmes." Lord Kilburn gestured toward the chair opposite him, his voice low and strained. "I am afraid the matter at hand is more complicated than I first indicated. I have been unable to make sense of it, which is why I called for your assistance." Holmes sat, the brandy swishing slightly as he took a measured sip, all the while observing the room's occupants. He set the glass down carefully, never breaking his gaze from Lord Kilburn. "Complicated, you say? But of course, everything in life, when examined with enough attention, reveals complexity." Eleanor Kilburn, her presence commanding yet subtle, stood by the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames as if lost in thought. The flickering light caught the sharp angles of her face, highlighting a cool composure, though her eyes were shadowed with concern. Her posture, rigid yet graceful, hinted at a woman accustomed to holding her ground in the face of adversity. As she turned toward them, her eyes met Holmes's briefly, an intense, almost defiant look that spoke volumes, though her lips remained still. "We are dealing with a loss, Mr. Holmes," Eleanor finally spoke, her voice cool but laced with an undercurrent of something Holmes could not quite place. "A family heirloom, something that has been in our possession for generations, has disappeared. The circumstances surrounding it are perplexing." "Disappeared?" Holmes repeated, his gaze shifting to Eleanor, measuring her words. "Not stolen, then? You speak as though it simply vanished." His tone was both questioning and analytical, but it did not convey judgment. Holmes rarely judged a person before understanding them fully. His mind was far more concerned with the puzzle itself. Eleanor's lips tightened, a subtle sign of discomfort. She shifted her gaze away from Holmes and back to the fire, her fingers twitching at her side. "It's not as simple as that. The piece, the shadow, as it is known, was secured in a locked room. No one entered, no one left, yet it is gone. There's no sign of forced entry, and no one admits to seeing anything unusual." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, and he turned toward Lord Kilburn. "Is this all the information you have?" Lord Kilburn hesitated, the strain on his face deepening. "There's more, but it's not easily spoken of. You see, the shadow was not just an heirloom. It's rumoured to be tied to a treasure, a family secret, one that has been guarded for generations. The words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of his face as he processed the information. A treasure, you say? And this heirloom, this shadow, has been in your family's possession for... how long? Longer than I can remember, Lord Kilburn replied. Its origins date back to my great-great-grandfather, who brought it with him from abroad. It is said to hold the key to a fortune that could change the course of our family's future. Eleanor stiffened at her father's words, but she did not speak. Instead, she stepped closer to the fire, her profile bathed in its warm light, as if seeking some comfort in its crackling warmth. Her silence spoke volumes to Holmes. He sensed there was more to her reluctance than simple unease. And you, Miss Kilburn? Holmes addressed her now, his voice unhurried but keen. What can you tell me of the disappearance? Eleanor's gaze flickered toward Holmes, and for a moment, their eyes locked in an unspoken understanding, though neither said a word. She cleared her throat, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. I've told you all I know, Mr. Holmes. I was in my study when it happened. I never left, and yet I know something is amiss. The heirloom is not just an object to us, it is a symbol. Its loss is not only a crime, it is a betrayal of everything our family stands for. Holmes took in her words, his gaze never wavering. There was something in her delivery, something in the way she spoke of the heirloom, that told him there was more to her story than she had let on. He had observed the tension in her posture, the tightness in her voice, the subtle glances exchanged between her and her father. This was not a simple theft. There was an emotional weight attached to this loss, one that could lead him to the heart of the mystery. Very well, Holmes said after a long pause, his voice calm, but his eyes sharp. I will need to examine the room where the heirloom was kept, as well as speak with any staff members who may have been present that night. If we are to uncover the truth, we must first understand everything that surrounds this family and their secrets. Watson, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. Holmes, what do you think this means? A treasure hidden within the heirloom? Holmes turned to Watson, a faint smile playing on his lips. That, my dear Watson, is what we are about to discover. But remember, the most important question is not what is lost, but who stands to gain from it. As the weight of his words settled in the room, both Kilburns remained still, the quiet crackle of the fire the only sound that filled the heavy silence. Holmes stood up, signalling for Watson to follow. The investigation was only beginning, but already Holmes knew that this case was far from ordinary. The game had begun. The evening outside had settled into an oppressive quiet, the fog thickening as they moved toward the room where the shadow had once been kept. Holmes's steps were deliberate, each one calculated, as though the very ground beneath his feet was part of a puzzle that he was destined to solve. Watson, just a step behind, could not help but observe the growing tension in his friend's every movement. Holmes had yet to speak a word since they had left the study, his mind already working in overdrive. The weight of the case had settled on him in the way it always did, unseen, but palpable and unwavering. Lord Kilburn led the way, his hands wringing together nervously, the faint scent of brandy still lingering on his breath. As they approached the door to the room, he paused, his fingers hovering over the knob. His eyes darted nervously between Holmes and the door, as though he feared what lay beyond it. Finally, he turned the knob and opened the door with a creak that seemed too loud for the moment. The room was large, more a chamber than a study, and filled with heavy wooden furniture that reflected an era long past. The centerpiece, however, had been the pedestal where the shadow had rested for years. But now the space was empty. The pedestal stood alone, a silent testament to the mystery that had unraveled since its removal. Holmes stepped into the room first, his eyes immediately drawn to the spot where the sculpture had once been. The area surrounding the pedestal was undisturbed, no signs of struggle or broken glass. Yet, it was the absence of the object itself that created the most unease. Holmes's gaze swept the room methodically, his eyes catching the smallest of details: the faint dust pattern on the shelf, the slight discoloration of the rug beneath the pedestal, the curtains that billowed slightly in the breeze, though no window had been opened. "Strange," Holmes muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone in particular. He moved toward the pedestal, crouching down to inspect the floor. This is not a simple theft. There has been care taken to leave no obvious traces. Watson, who had followed Holmes into the room, looked around. It doesn't make sense. If someone took it, they had to have entered somehow. And yet, the room shows no sign of forced entry, not even a footprint. Holmes straightened, his brow furrowing in thought. Indeed. It is as if the object simply vanished. He turned toward Lord Kilburn, who stood by the doorway, his face pale. "When did you last see the sculpture, Lord Kilburn?" "Last evening," the Lord replied, his voice unsteady. "I was in here before retiring for the night, checking on the heirloom. It was in its place, untouched. I had it checked every evening, for safety." Watson frowned. "So it was last seen? What, some time before you went to bed? And no one has entered the room since?" Kilburn nodded, the tremor in his hands becoming more pronounced. "I would swear on my life that the door was locked. I keep the key on my person at all times. I have not let anyone near it." Holmes turned his gaze toward the locked door, his lips pressed into a thin line. "The key," he murmured. "I presume it is here with you now?" The Lord hesitated before reaching into his coat pocket and producing a small, ornate key. "Yes, here it is." Holmes took the key from Kilburn's outstretched hand, inspecting it with great care. The metal gleamed faintly under the low light, its intricate design telling the story of its age and lineage. He turned it over in his fingers, then raised an eyebrow. "Is there another key?" Holmes asked, his voice more pointed now, though still calm. Kilburn blinked, confusion crossing his features. "No, only this one." Holmes's gaze did not waver as he stared at the lock. "Interesting, very interesting." He looked back at Watson. It would seem that someone had access to the room despite the locked door. Lord Kilburn's face contorted, a flicker of panic surfacing beneath his controlled exterior. "But how? How could this happen?" "I kept the key with me. No one else had access." Holmes walked slowly around the room, his steps almost silent, as though the very air itself was holding its breath. He paused by the window, noting that it was indeed locked from the inside, just as it should be. But there was something about the window that caught his attention. The frame was slightly askew, the faintest of marks on the sill, as though something had been pressed against it recently. "There is a discrepancy here," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying an unsettling certainty. "The window is locked, but someone could have accessed the room from another point of entry." Watson's brow furrowed. "Another point of entry? But how?" Holmes moved back to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the walls with unblinking intensity. "There are no obvious signs of entry through the window, no broken panes, but there may be another way." He turned to Kilburn, his gaze sharp. "Tell me, Lord Kilburn, is there a secret passage in this house? One that would allow access to this room?" The Lord's face went ashen. He swallowed hard before answering, his voice barely a whisper. There is one. A hidden passage from the old servants' quarters. But it has been sealed for years." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest, and he straightened, his posture growing even more commanding. "Sealed, you say? And yet, the room is empty." Kilburn's expression faltered, and he glanced at his daughter as though seeking reassurance. But Eleanor's face remained impassive, her eyes clouded with something else. Fear, perhaps, or something darker. Holmes approached the wall closest to the pedestal and pressed his fingers against it, feeling the stone beneath. "We must investigate this passage," he said, his voice growing more resolute with each word. The room was dim, the air thick with the dust of years gone by. Holmes stood before the stone wall, his fingers tracing the subtle outline of a hidden panel, the cool texture beneath his fingertips betraying the warmth of the room. The faintest of draughts whispered through the cracks, carrying with it the smell of old wood and damp stone. It was as if the very air had been holding its breath for decades, waiting for someone to disturb the secrets it guarded. Holmes turned to Lord Kilburn, who stood nearby, his face a mixture of frustration and unease. Eleanor, too, had remained silent, her expression unreadable as she watched her father. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her stance one of defensiveness. Watson, ever the observer, kept his distance but paid careful attention to the nuances of the situation, the subtle shifts in posture, the glances exchanged between the Kilburns, the tension that seemed to ripple through the room. "It appears we have a passage," Holmes murmured, his voice low but resolute. "But why has it been sealed, Lord Kilburn? If you knew of its existence, why would you have left it untouched?" Kilburn shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting away from Holmes and toward the hidden panel. "It was a relic of the house, one of the old secrets. We never used it. My father always said it was best to leave such things alone. The servants were warned, and the passage was bricked up long ago." Eleanor's voice broke through the tension. "It was sealed because we didn't want anyone knowing of it. Not after what happened." Holmes's gaze shifted toward her, his expression unchanging but his mind already processing her words. "What happened, Miss Kilburn? You seem to know more than you've let on." Eleanor hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty before she finally spoke. "It was a long time ago. My great-grandfather. He was involved in something that was meant to be kept buried. This passage was part of it, part of a time when the family was not so respectable." Holmes nodded, the pieces beginning to fit together in his mind. "And now it seems this passage has resurfaced, along with your family's secrets." Lord Kilburn's voice was tight, betraying a nervous edge. "We've kept it sealed for a reason. No one has used it in decades, and no one should now. It was never meant to be disturbed." But Holmes was not so easily deterred. "I beg to differ, Lord Kilburn. It seems the very disturbance you feared has occurred, and I suspect this disturbance is at the heart of the disappearance of your heirloom." Holmes stepped closer to the wall, his mind working quickly as he surveyed the area for any clues that might reveal how the passage had been accessed. He could sense that something had been tampered with, something subtle, yet deliberate. His eyes narrowed as he examined the faint marks along the stone, barely perceptible to the untrained eye, but telling a different story to his sharp senses. "There is evidence of a disturbance here," Holmes said, his voice low, almost to himself. He leaned in closer, inspecting the wall with intense scrutiny. "Someone has used this passage recently. The marks on the wall suggest that it was opened within the last few days. There is no dust, no indication that this area has been undisturbed for any significant length of time." Eleanor's face paled as Holmes spoke, her gaze darting away from him. She took a step back, her fingers nervously brushing against the fabric of her dress. Lord Kilburn, too, seemed to shrink in the face of Holmes's observations, his posture betraying the tension that had been simmering beneath his surface for some time. "You're suggesting someone in this house used the passage?" Watson asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Holmes's eyes flicked to him briefly, before returning to the wall. "Indeed, Watson. It is the only explanation. The key to the mystery lies in who has access to this room, and this passage. It seems the thief, if we are to call them that, is someone with intimate knowledge of the house and its secrets." Lord Kilburn shifted uncomfortably, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "But I don't understand. The servants, they would never—" "Perhaps," Holmes interrupted, his voice sharp but calm, "but someone in this house knows far more than they have let on." There was a pause in the room, a heavy silence that settled over the three of them. Holmes's eyes remained focused on the wall, his mind turning over the possibilities. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but there were still gaps. Gaps that could lead them to the true nature of the crime. Eleanor's voice, though quiet, cut through the silence. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes. My father, he has done everything to protect the family. No one would dare betray us like this." Holmes finally turned away from the wall, his gaze settling on her with an intensity that was both probing and compassionate. "Miss Kilburn, I am not suggesting betrayal, at least not in the way you may think. But the theft of this heirloom, coupled with the secrets of this house, suggests that the person who took it knew exactly what they were doing, and they were not working alone." Kilburn looked at Holmes, his face a portrait of helplessness. "You think there are accomplices? I don't know who to trust anymore. I've kept my family's legacy hidden for so long. Could this have been planned by someone outside? Someone with knowledge of these old secrets?" Holmes did not immediately respond, instead turning back to examine the passageway once again. His fingers gently traced the edges of the hidden door, feeling for any further clues that might reveal its mechanism. The weight of the moment hung in the air, heavy with the knowledge that the case was much more than a simple theft. "This," Holmes finally said, his voice filled with certainty, "was not the work of a casual thief. The person who took the shadow knew the house, knew the passage, and knew what it was worth. This is not a random act. This is a message." Eleanor looked up, her eyes flashing with something new, a mixture of fear and understanding. "A message? From whom?" Holmes did not answer her directly, his gaze flicking briefly to Watson before turning back to the wall. "We must discover who in this house has a motive to see this legacy disrupted. Only then will we understand why the shadow was taken." The air outside had grown cooler by the time they emerged from the hidden passageway, and Holmes found himself scrutinizing every detail, every movement of those who stood before him. As he walked down the long corridor of Lord Kilburn's estate, the scent of polished wood and distant fires lingered in the air, mixing with the unmistakable tension that hummed through the walls of the house. The game had begun in earnest, and with each passing moment, Holmes felt the weight of his next move. Inside the study, the atmosphere had shifted. Gone was the polite distance of strangers meeting for the first time. Now, there was something sharper, something more urgent. The Kilburn family had retreated into a world of half-truths and uncertainties, and it was up to Holmes to navigate that murky water. The servants who had been questioned earlier had retreated to their quarters, their gazes occasionally darting nervously toward Holmes as he passed. Holmes wasted no time, already outlining his next steps. "Watson, you will speak with the servants again, those who were on duty the night of the disappearance. I want to know everything, no matter how insignificant it may seem. If there is a crack in their stories, I will find it." Watson nodded, though a hint of skepticism lingered in his expression. "And what of Miss Kilburn and her father? Will they remain in the dark for now?" "Indeed," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned toward the study. "For now, we need to understand the whole picture. Miss Kilburn is an enigma, and I suspect there is much she has not said. Her father, too. There is something beneath his calm demeanor. He is not as innocent as he would have us believe." As Watson moved to execute Holmes's orders, the detective himself made his way toward Lord Kilburn's study, his steps echoing softly down the hall. The door creaked open with a subtle groan as he entered, the dim light from the fireplace casting long shadows across the floor. Lord Kilburn sat behind his desk, his fingers nervously tapping against the surface of his papers. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, as though each word that passed between them would add to the invisible weight pressing down on everyone in the house. "Lord Kilburn," Holmes began, his voice calm yet charged with a quiet intensity, "I must ask you to recount your movements from the night of the disappearance. Every detail, if you please, no matter how trivial it may seem." Kilburn's eyes flickered, a fleeting moment of uncertainty crossing his face before he responded. "I told you before, Mr. Holmes. I was in my study all evening, finishing some correspondence. I checked on the heirloom before retiring for the night, and that was the last time I saw it." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "And the door was locked, as you stated? You were alone in this room the entire time?" "Yes," Kilburn said quickly, perhaps a touch too quickly. "I was alone. No one came or went from the study after I locked the door." Holmes studied him for a moment longer before responding. "And did anyone else in the house know of your routine? Who else had access to the room, aside from you?" Kilburn's eyes shifted, his lips parting slightly, as though weighing whether to reveal something more. "My daughter, of course, knew I kept the key with me. She often asks about the heirloom, but she's never shown any particular interest in it. Aside from that, no one had access." Holmes raised an eyebrow at the mention of Eleanor, though he said nothing. "You mentioned earlier that your great-grandfather had been involved in a matter surrounding the heirloom. Could you elaborate on that? What exactly did he leave behind? And why has it remained a secret for so long?" Kilburn's posture stiffened at the mention of his ancestor, and for a brief moment the mask of composure slipped. His voice trembled ever so slightly as he answered, "That's not something I'm prepared to discuss, Mr. Holmes. It is a family matter, one that has been buried for decades." Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes still trained on the Lord. "I see. But secrets often have a way of resurfacing, Lord Kilburn, and when they do, they have a tendency to bring chaos in their wake." A silence fell over them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. The weight of the conversation hung between them like a thick fog, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Holmes rose from his chair and moved toward the window, his mind already sorting through the fragments of information Kilburn had provided. The picture was becoming clearer, but there was still much to uncover. Holmes knew that beneath Lord Kilburn's defensive demeanour lay a man who was hiding something crucial. But what? Before he could ask another question, the door opened softly, and Eleanor entered the room. She closed the door behind her, her gaze steady as she met Holmes's eyes. "You wish to speak with me, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her voice calm, but laced with an undercurrent of something Holmes couldn't quite place. Holmes turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Indeed, Miss Kilburn. If you would be so kind as to share with me your account of the night the heirloom disappeared." Eleanor's gaze flickered briefly to her father, but she remained composed. "I've already told you everything I know, Mr. Holmes," she replied, her tone even, though there was a certain sharpness in her words. "I was in my study, as I always am in the evenings. I never left." Holmes's gaze hardened slightly. "Is that all? You were alone?" Eleanor nodded, but there was something in the way her shoulders tensed, something that told Holmes she was hiding more than she let on. "I was alone. No one came to see me, if that's what you're implying." Holmes studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You see, Miss Kilburn, I find it hard to believe that no one came to see you, especially given the circumstances surrounding this heirloom. Tell me, why did you not mention the secret passage earlier?" Eleanor's face paled slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line as she met Holmes's gaze head-on. "I didn't think it mattered," she said coolly. "It's an old family relic. My father sealed it off years ago for a reason." Holmes's voice grew softer, more insistent. "But secrets, Miss Kilburn, rarely remain buried forever. And sometimes, when they surface, they reveal more than we are prepared to handle." The heavy silence in the room lingered like a shroud, thick and suffocating. Holmes stood by the window, his eyes tracing the faint outlines of the city beyond, though his mind remained sharp and focused on the puzzle at hand. He had always been an observer, a man whose attention to detail was unmatched, but even he could not ignore the sense that something was deeply amiss in Lord Kilburn's household. Eleanor stood with her arms crossed, her posture rigid, though the flicker of discomfort in her eyes told a different story. Lord Kilburn, his face drawn with strain, sat back in his chair, his fingers once again tapping nervously against the armrest. There was a crackling tension in the room, like the electric charge before a storm. Holmes, having absorbed the various accounts from the family and the servants, now felt the weight of the contradictions pressing against him. Every conversation had left him with more questions than answers, and the fragmented pieces of the puzzle refused to align. His mind was working at full capacity, processing the nuances in their words, the slight shifts in their expressions, and the unsaid things that were now beginning to gather in the air between them. "The timing of your statements, Lord Kilburn," Holmes began, his voice cutting through the stillness, "does not align with the evidence. You've told me that the room was locked when you last checked it, but there was no sign of forced entry. That leaves us with only two possibilities. Either someone entered the room with a key, or..." Lord Kilburn shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze flicking toward Eleanor before returning to Holmes. "Or what, Mr. Holmes?" "Or someone within the house has been misleading us," Holmes said sharply, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable edge. "You claim that only you and Miss Kilburn knew of the heirloom's significance, but Miss Kilburn's behaviour, her knowledge of the passageway, and the subtle tension in her words suggest otherwise." Eleanor's eyes narrowed at Holmes's words, but she said nothing, her lips pressed tightly together. The flicker of surprise was quickly replaced with a guarded expression, but Holmes could sense the defensive walls that had begun to rise around her. Her cool composure was cracking, revealing the raw unease beneath. "Miss Kilburn," Holmes continued, his voice calm but insistent, "there are contradictions in your account. You've told me that you were in your study all evening, but if that were true, why did you not mention the secret passage until now?" Eleanor's hands trembled slightly at her sides, a faint but telling movement that caught Holmes's keen eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to falter before they left her lips. Instead, she turned her gaze to her father, seeking something. Reassurance, perhaps, or permission. Lord Kilburn's face remained unreadable, though there was a subtle tightening in his jaw. I didn't think it mattered," Eleanor said finally, her voice strained, though the edge of guilt was unmistakable in her tone. "It's an old part of the house, one that's been closed off for as long as I can remember. I never thought it would be relevant." Holmes watched her carefully, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "You see, Miss Kilburn, this is the exact sort of behaviour I've come to expect in a case such as this. People tend to hide what they know when they think it might expose them." The room seemed to grow even quieter, the weight of Holmes's observation settling over them like a thick fog. Lord Kilburn, who had remained oddly silent through the exchange, shifted in his chair once again, his discomfort now more apparent. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low, "you must understand. This is a matter of family history. The passageway, the heirloom, it is tied to something. Something I never intended for anyone to uncover. It was all supposed to remain buried." Holmes's gaze sharpened, the unspoken words hanging between them. "And yet it seems, Lord Kilburn, that something is pushing this family to the edge. What exactly is it that you've been hiding for all these years?" The question, direct and pointed, caused a flicker of fear to cross Kilburn's face. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to falter, caught in a chokehold of his own making. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "I cannot," Lord Kilburn began, his voice breaking slightly. "I cannot tell you. Not yet." Holmes took a step closer, his presence commanding but not intrusive. "Lord Kilburn, you must understand that by withholding the truth, you're only complicating things further. Whoever is responsible for taking the shadow is someone who knows your family's secrets. It's not just about the heirloom anymore. It's about what it represents." At his words, Eleanor's expression faltered. For the briefest of moments, the mask of composure slipped, and Holmes saw a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, something that spoke of guilt, of fear, and perhaps even of betrayal. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced once more by her composed exterior. "I told you," Eleanor said, her voice growing more insistent. "I don't know what you're suggesting, I had nothing to do with it. Holmes's gaze remained on her, unwavering. And yet, Miss Kilburn, the truth will come out. It always does. It's simply a matter of time. Eleanor stepped back, her posture stiff, her voice cold. I don't have to stand here and be accused of something I didn't do. I've told you all I know. Holmes watched her retreat, her words hanging in the air long after she had crossed the threshold of the study and closed the door behind her. The weight of the room seemed to lift slightly, though the tension remained, thick and unyielding. Lord Kilburn, now alone with Holmes, seemed to sag with relief, though the burden of the truth hung heavily over him. Holmes studied him for a moment, his mind racing through the contradictions, the lies, and the hidden truths that had yet to be uncovered. I will return in the morning, Holmes said, his voice low, his gaze never leaving Kilburn's. And I expect you to be more forthcoming with the truth. Only then will we be able to uncover who truly stands behind this theft, and why. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting pale shafts of sunlight that illuminated the study's dim corners. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his fingers absent-mindedly brushing over the intricately carved mantel, his thoughts far removed from the present. The faint crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room, but it did little to fill the silence that had descended upon him. His mind, always in motion, was locked in a meticulous dance, piecing together the fragments of the case like a masterful puzzle. Yet, despite his analytical brilliance, a lingering uncertainty gnawed at him. The previous evening's conversations echoed in his mind, Lord Kilburn's reluctance to speak of the family's secrets, Eleanor's defensive walls, the subtle contradictions in their words, and the ever-present tension that had grown thicker with every passing hour. Holmes had learned to trust his instincts, to follow the trail wherever it led, but this case seemed elusive. Every time he thought he had a grip on it, another layer of complexity revealed itself. Watson entered the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He had spent the morning revisiting the servants, speaking to those who had been on duty the night of the heirloom's disappearance. His face, though calm, betrayed the exhaustion of a man who had spent hours sorting through half-truths and contradictions. "Holmes?" Watson began, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I spoke with the staff again. They're all pointing the finger at each other, but no one seems to have seen anything. One of the maids claims she heard something strange during the night, footsteps, muffled voices, but when I pressed her for more details, she clammed up. She's either hiding something or is genuinely afraid." Holmes turned toward Watson, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Fear, Watson, is often the most telling of emotions. It speaks louder than any words ever could. But fear of what?" Watson sighed, dropping into the armchair beside the fireplace. "The problem is that none of the staff can corroborate one another's stories. Everyone's accounts are fractured, contradictory. But I've noted one thing that may be of interest. The butler, Thomas, has a particular way of avoiding questions, as if he knows more than he lets on. His alibi is flimsy at best." Holmes smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Thomas, you say? Interesting. His behaviour matches something I've observed in Lord Kilburn as well. Both seem to be skirting the edges of truth, carefully avoiding what they know may lead to something far darker." Holmes returned to his position in front of the fireplace, his gaze once again drifting to the mantelpiece, though his thoughts were far from idle. The puzzle pieces, though numerous, seemed to form a coherent shape in his mind. He began to speak, his voice low and measured, as though working through the case aloud. "The disappearance of the heirloom is not merely a crime of opportunity. No, this theft was deliberate, planned meticulously. The absence of forced entry is crucial. Whoever took the shadow had a key, and that key was within the family's grasp. But the real question lies in the timing. Why now? Why take the heirloom at this particular moment, when it had been secure for generations?" Watson leaned forward, his interest piqued. "It's the timing that's been bothering me as well. The theft didn't happen by chance. It feels like someone is sending a message." "Precisely. Holmes replied, his eyes lighting up with sudden clarity. This is no random act of theft. The heirloom, the shadow, is not just a family treasure. It's a symbol that has held secrets for generations. Lord Kilburn's reluctance to discuss his great-grandfather's involvement suggests that there are forces at play that are far beyond mere greed. This is about legacy, about something far older than the heirloom itself. Watson's brow furrowed as he processed the implications. You think someone is trying to uncover those secrets? Holmes nodded slowly. I do. The heirloom's value isn't just in its physical form. It's in the history it holds, the treasure it supposedly guards, the passageway in the house. It leads to something hidden, something tied to the Kilburn family's past. Someone knows about it, and they are willing to do whatever it takes to claim it. Watson's gaze shifted to the door, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment with a revelation. But who, Holmes? Who in the house could be behind this? Holmes turned toward Watson, his eyes narrowing slightly. The Kilburns themselves, of course, but not in the way you might think. Both Lord Kilburn and Eleanor have something to hide. They each know more than they're willing to admit, but neither of them is the thief. They are players in a much larger game. Watson's confusion deepened. Then who is the thief, Holmes? Who could be using the Kilburns as pawns in this scheme? Holmes paced the room, his mind racing. Consider the servants. They know the house intimately, perhaps better than Lord Kilburn himself, and one of them, at least, has something to gain from the theft. But it is not merely the heirloom they seek. It is the treasure, hidden, guarded by the very family who now believes it lost. Holmes paused in front of the large window, his gaze drifting out toward the estate beyond. The fog that had clung to London the night before had begun to lift, though a chill remained in the air, a reminder of the mystery that still shrouded the house. Eleanor knows more than she lets on. I suspect she has been aware of the treasure for much longer than she has admitted. But she too is being manipulated. Someone is playing a much larger game here, using her to get closer to what they seek. Watson stood, his movements sharp as he approached Holmes. Do you mean Thomas, the butler, or one of the other servants? Holmes turned to him, his face hardening with newfound resolve. Thomas is likely the key. He is close to Lord Kilburn, but the true mastermind is someone who knows the family's secrets. Someone who has been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. There was a brief silence, the weight of the words settling over them. Holmes's mind was already racing ahead, connecting the dots between the servants, the family's hidden history, and the long-forgotten treasure. His deduction had led him to the brink of a revelation, but there was still one piece missing, one final clue that would tie everything together. I will confront Thomas this afternoon, Holmes said, his voice steady and filled with purpose. But first, we must speak to Eleanor once more. She is the link between the past and the present. She knows more than she has let on, and it is time to uncover the truth. The afternoon had settled into a heavy quiet, the tension in the house palpable as Holmes made his way through the dim corridors of Kilburn's estate. The walls, lined with ancient tapestries and portraits of long-dead ancestors, seemed to close in around him, their painted eyes watching, as though they were silent witnesses to the secrets now bubbling to the surface. Holmes had spent the morning gathering the final pieces of the puzzle, interviewing the servants, and revisiting the hidden passageway. But now, as he made his way toward the study where the final confrontation would take place, he felt the weight of the case settle around him with a deeper urgency. The theft of the shadow was no ordinary crime. It was the culmination of years of hidden truths, forgotten legacies, and a desperate desire to claim something far more valuable than a mere heirloom. Watson, ever the steady presence by his side, walked silently, his face a mask of quiet anticipation. They had both grown accustomed to Holmes's unshakable certainty, but even Watson could sense that this was different. There was an edge to Holmes now, a quiet intensity that hinted at the truth about to unfold. As they reached the study, Holmes motioned for Watson to wait outside. The door, heavy and imposing, creaked open with a slow, deliberate groan. Lord Kilburn sat at his desk, the same uneasy tension on his face. But there was something new in his eyes now, an unmistakable flicker of dread, as though he knew that the end of this long-standing mystery was drawing near. Eleanor stood by the window, her back to the room. She did not turn when Holmes entered, but her posture was stiff, as though bracing for something. The room was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the curtains. It seemed to Holmes the perfect setting for the truth to emerge, hidden, shadowed, and long concealed. "Mr. Holmes?" Lord Kilburn's voice broke the silence, but it was strained, as though speaking was a labour. "You've found something, haven't you?" Holmes stood just inside the door, his eyes scanning the room as he took in the details. The air in the study was thick, heavy with the scent of old books, aged wood, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like the residue of long-buried secrets. He could feel the weight of their gaze upon him, but he remained steady, his mind already working, sorting through the web of lies, contradictions, and half-truths. "Yes," Holmes replied, his voice steady but laced with an edge. "I have found more than I could have anticipated." He moved toward the centre of the room, his gaze shifting to Eleanor, whose back remained turned. Holmes could almost hear her pulse quicken in the stillness, though she made no move to acknowledge him. Instead, her fingers clenched the fabric of her dress, her shoulders tense with what could only be described as fear. "I've spoken to the servants," Holmes continued, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's rigid form, "and to Lord Kilburn. The stories they've told do not align. In fact, they never have. The pieces I've gathered, when examined with precision, have led me to a singular conclusion." Eleanor's shoulders stiffened further, and she finally turned, her face pale but composed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What conclusion, Mr. Holmes?" Her voice, though steady, trembled slightly on the last word, betraying her calm exterior. Holmes looked at her now, his gaze sharp, piercing. "That you, Miss Kilburn, have been the one to orchestrate this entire charade." A sharp breath escaped from Lord Kilburn's lips as his eyes widened in disbelief. He stood up from his desk, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the edge of the table. Eleanor, however, did not flinch. Her gaze met Holmes's with a mix of defiance and resignation. "What are you saying?" Lord Kilburn's voice cracked with disbelief. "Eleanor? My daughter?" Holmes's gaze never wavered. "Yes, Lord Kilburn. Miss Kilburn has been behind the disappearance of the heirloom. She orchestrated the theft not for money, not for greed, but to protect a much darker secret, a secret buried deep in the Kilburn family's past." Eleanor's face hardened, her posture unyielding. She opened her mouth to speak, but Holmes held up a hand, signalling for her to remain silent. His eyes flicked back to the desk, where a small, ornate box sat slightly ajar, its contents hidden but unmistakably familiar. "It's the treasure, isn't it?" Holmes asked, his voice steady. "The one your great-grandfather hid. The one your family has kept secret for so long. The shadow wasn't just an heirloom. It was a map, wasn't it? A map to the treasure that you've spent years trying to protect." Eleanor's lips parted in something between surprise and disbelief, but she said nothing. Holmes took a step forward, his gaze flicking between father and daughter, the two of them now locked in a silent battle of wills. "You couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands," Holmes continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. "You, Miss Kilburn, have been protecting the legacy of your family, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Fear that if the treasure were found, it would unravel everything. The heirloom, the passage, the family's entire history. It's all tied together. And you knew that, in the end, it would all come down to this." The tension in the room thickened, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Eleanor's gaze never left Holmes, her expression unreadable, but her hands, once clasped tightly at her sides, now trembled ever so slightly. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke, her voice cold, her words slow, but deliberate. "You think you've figured it out, don't you? But you're wrong. You don't know what this means. You don't understand what's at stake here." Holmes leaned in slightly, his voice softening, though it held the weight of unspoken truth. "I understand more than you think, Miss Kilburn. This isn't just about treasure. It's about the power that comes with it, the power to control your family's fate, to rewrite its history, and to keep its darkest secrets buried. But it's time to let those secrets come to light." For the first time, a flicker of something broke through Eleanor's composed facade, a flicker of regret, of guilt. She glanced at her father, who stood motionless, his face pale, his eyes locked on the ground. Holmes's voice grew colder, sharper. "The truth is a powerful thing, Miss Kilburn, and no matter how long you try to hide it, it will always come to light, whether you like it or not." The weight of the moment hung in the air long after Holmes had made his final revelation. The walls of the study, once so imposing, now seemed to shrink with the burden of truth, the shadows receding as the light from the afternoon grew stronger. Eleanor, her face pale and taut with emotion, stood frozen, her gaze flickering from Holmes to her father, as though searching for some sign of solace, some flicker of the family she had once known. Lord Kilburn, too, stood motionless, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, his face a portrait of conflicting emotions, guilt, regret, and perhaps fear of what this moment would mean for his family's future. Holmes, ever the observer, did not allow the gravity of the situation to sway him. His eyes remained focused on Eleanor, as if waiting for her to finally break the silence that had settled over them like a heavy fog. The tension between father and daughter was palpable, as though the very air between them had thickened with years of unspoken words, old wounds, and hidden truths. After what felt like an eternity, Eleanor spoke, her voice a fragile whisper. "You don't understand, Mr. Holmes. You don't understand what this treasure means, what it could mean for our future. It was never about greed. It was about preserving something far beyond the value of gold or jewels. It was about power and control." Her words cut through the stillness, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Holmes did not move, but his eyes softened ever so slightly as he took in her confession. It was not the first time he had encountered such desperation, such fear, the desire to protect a family legacy at any cost. But this was different. This was a woman who had been torn between loyalty to her blood and the undeniable truth that had now come crashing down upon her. "I understand more than you think, Miss Kilburn," Holmes replied, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet compassion. "You've been protecting something that was never truly yours to keep. This treasure, this so-called legacy, it was built on lies, and you've been caught in the web of those lies, just as your father has." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, her hands shaking at her sides. She turned to her father, her gaze pleading, but Lord Kilburn remained silent, his eyes cast downward, as though ashamed of the secrets he had buried for so long. "Father," Eleanor said, her voice cracking, "why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me with the truth?" Lord Kilburn's face, once a mask of stern authority, now crumpled under the weight of his daughter's words. His shoulders slumped, and he finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I was protecting you, Eleanor. I thought that by keeping this secret, I could keep you safe from the darkness of our family's past. But now I see that I was wrong. I've made a terrible mistake." Holmes stood silent, watching the painful reconciliation unfold before him. He had known deep down that this was not just a case of theft. It was about far more than an heirloom. It was about the fractured trust between a father and his daughter, the broken promises, and the choices that had been made to preserve the family's reputation at all costs. As the weight of those words settled, Holmes took a step forward, breaking the fragile moment. "It's over now," he said, his voice firm, though it held no malice. The truth has been exposed. There is no hiding from it anymore. Lord Kilburn nodded, his face pale with the realization of what his actions had cost. I know, Mr. Holmes. I know. For a moment, the room was still. The air had shifted, heavy, thick with regret, and the slow, inevitable acceptance of the truth. But there was something else too. A glimmer of understanding, however faint, seemed to pass between father and daughter, a silent acknowledgement that, despite everything, they still had each other. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward from this darkness. Holmes, always the pragmatist, allowed the moment to linger, though he knew that their journey toward resolution was far from complete. I will take my leave now, he said quietly, turning toward Watson, who had been standing at the doorway, a silent witness to the unravelling of the Kilburn family's secrets. I have gathered all that I need. The truth has been revealed, and justice will follow its course. Watson stepped forward, his eyes meeting Holmes's with a mixture of admiration and understanding. What will happen now, Holmes? What about the treasure? Holmes's gaze lingered on the Kilburns for a moment before answering. The treasure, Watson, is no longer the issue. The real value of this case lies in the truth that has been brought to light. As for the treasure, it remains buried, and perhaps that is where it belongs. Some secrets are better left hidden. With that, Holmes turned and made his way toward the door, his mind already moving on to the next mystery, the next puzzle to be solved. But as he stepped out into the corridor, he felt the weight of the Kilburn family's fate hanging in the balance behind him. Outside, the world was quiet, the fog still lingering in the streets. But for the first time in a long while, Holmes felt a sense of resolution, of closure. The game was over. The pieces had fallen into place. And for once, there was peace.